I have known Callum de Verru, the Highland Duke of Strathmore, since we were boys of 12, thrown together at a school neither of us wanted to attend, and in all those years I have seen him do many things that defied easy explanation. I have seen him ride into a winter gale without a coat. I have seen him stand in a room full of lords and dukes and earls, say nothing, and still command every eye. But the thing I witnessed on that grey November morning at Penhowick's solicitor's office in Edinburgh, that is the story I have told more than any other, because it is the one that proves something I always suspected about him. That beneath the ice of the Highland Duke, there was a man who knew, in his blood, the difference between a debt and a cage. I should begin with what I knew of the matter before that morning. The late Mr. Edmund Faraday of Caldenvale had been a quiet, stubborn, brilliantly impractical man, a mill owner whose estate sat on a generous stretch of the River Cald, whose waters turned the wheel that ground half the valley's grain. He had borrowed, in a moment of poor judgment, a considerable sum from a Baron Hexworth, a man I would not have trusted with a halfpenny, let alone a mortgage, to modernize the mill and improve the tenant cottages. Faraday died before the debt was cleared. His daughter inherited the estate, the wheel, the river, and the Baron's claim in full. Her name was Miss Elinor Faraday, and I did not know her then. I knew only what Strathmore told me in clipped, careful language over breakfast the morning he received Hexworth's letter. The Baron had called the debt due at once. The daughter had 30 days to produce a sum she could not possibly produce, and Hexworth had, with the sort of oily courtesy that passes for generosity in certain circles, offered her an alternative. She could sign the estate over entirely, removing herself as any encumbrance. Or she could agree to marry a man of the Baron's choosing, a cousin of Hexworth's, a creature of 50 with a reputation that made me set down my fork. "How do you know this?" I asked Strathmore. He turned to look out the window at the grey Edinburgh sky. "Faraday was a friend to my father," he said, "years ago. I never met the daughter." "And yet," I said, "here you are reading Hexworth's letter over your kedgeree." He folded the letter and said nothing further. He ate in silence, and when he was finished, he rang for his carriage. I went with him, because I always went with him when something in his bearing told me the day was about to become interesting. The offices of Messrs. Penhowick and Soult occupied the second floor of a stone building on Advocates' Close, the sort of place designed to impress upon you the gravity of financial arrangements, all dark wood and oil portraits of men who had never once smiled. When we arrived, a clerk tried to turn us away. The meeting with Miss Faraday was already in progress, he said, and the parties had asked not to be disturbed. Strathmore looked at him. I cannot adequately describe what that look was. It was not cruel. It was simply the look of a man who had never once in his life been denied entry to a room and had no intention of beginning now. The clerk stepped aside. Inside, seated at a long table beneath a portrait of some long-dead advocate, were 3 people. To the left, a round, red-faced man whose coat strained at its buttons, Baron Hexworth. I recognized him, having met him twice at Edinburgh assemblies and disliked him both times. Beside him, a much older man with the look of a solicitor who had learned long ago to keep his expression neutral. And across from them, sitting very upright in a wooden chair that was slightly too large for her, was a young woman. She was perhaps 23. She wore a dark gray gown, well made, but not new, the kind of gown that told you exactly as much as she intended to tell you and no more. Her hair was dark and simply dressed. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her, and she was looking at the papers spread before her with the particular expression of someone who has worked very hard not to look frightened and has nearly succeeded. Hexworth looked up at us, and his face went through several rapid calculations. "Strathmore," he said, "this is a private matter." "All the best ones are," Strathmore replied. He removed his gloves and took the empty chair beside Miss Faraday as if he had been expected. He looked at the papers on the table. He looked at the young woman. She looked back at him with eyes that were, I noted, not frightened at all. They were measuring. "You are the Duke of Strathmore," she said. It was not a question. "I am," he said, "and you are Edmund Faraday's daughter." "I am." A pause. "I did not request assistance." "I know. Then I will ask you plainly what it is you want." I liked her immediately. Hexworth had gone a color somewhere between coral and beetroot. The solicitor was looking at the ceiling. Strathmore said, "I want to see the document." She did not hand it to him. She was quite still for a moment, and then she said, "There are 2 of them." The first transfers the estate and the mill outright to the Baron, with a sum in compensation that my father's own solicitor has confirmed is approximately 1/5 of the property's value. The second, and here her voice remained perfectly level, which I thought was remarkable, proposes a marriage settlement, binding me to a Mr. Aldous Hexworth of Shropshire. Aldous, Strathmore said. The Baron's cousin. I know Aldous Hexworth. He said it in a tone that conveyed, in 6 syllables, everything one would ever need to know about Aldous Hexworth. The Baron stood up. Strathmore, I must. Sit down, Hexworth. The Baron sat. This also, I thought, required little explanation. Strathmore looked at the document for some time. He turned it over. He set it back on the table, and he looked not at Hexworth, not at the solicitor, but at the young woman beside him. I will settle the debt, he said. The full amount with 5% above the stated principal in acknowledgment of the inconvenience to the creditor. The estate reverts to you unencumbered. I require nothing of you in exchange. There was a silence in the room that had a texture to it. Miss Faraday's chin came up slightly. Require nothing, she repeated. Correct. That is not how these arrangements work, Your Grace. I am aware of how they usually work. Then you understand my skepticism. She looked at him with a directness that I doubted many women or men had directed at Strathmore across a solicitor's table. You do not know me. You knew my father, I am told, only at one remove. You owe me nothing, and yet you appear this morning prepared to settle a substantial debt and seek no return. This requires explanation. I had to admire her enormously. Strathmore said, I knew Edmund Faraday when I was 17 years old. He was the mill owner who refused to sell his land to my uncle when my uncle wished to acquire it and intended, I understand, to dam the river and leave the valley farmers without water. Your father held the line for 4 years. He kept the land, the mill, and the water rights at considerable cost to himself. He was a stubborn, difficult, principled man, and I respected him. He is dead, and I am not in the habit of watching the children of men I respected be sold for their father's debts. The room was quiet. Miss Faraday held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, The answer is still no. The solicitor made a sound. The Baron made a larger sound. I pressed my lips together to keep from smiling. No, she said again, more clearly. I thank you, Your Grace, for the intention. I do not doubt that it is, as you say, a matter of principle rather than advantage. But I will not have my estate settled by a stranger's money. I am not a charity case, and I do not intend to spend the rest of my life explaining to myself how a duke paid my father's debt. There must be another way. There is not, said the solicitor, finding his voice at last. Miss Faraday, I have reviewed the accounts. The estate cannot produce the required sum before the deadline. There is simply no mechanism by which. I know the accounts, she said. I drew them up. Then you know. I know they require a solution I have not yet found. She looked at the papers. Something moved across her face then, not defeat, but something close to the border of it, a thing held very tightly in check. I will need until this afternoon. Hexworth began to bluster. Strathmore said, She has until this afternoon, in the tone of a man announcing the weather, and Hexworth subsided. We left. In the carriage, I waited for Strathmore to say something. He said nothing for 3 streets. She refused you, I said at last. Yes. You are the Highland Duke of Strathmore. No one refuses you. She did. What will you do? He was looking out the window. Wait, he said, until this afternoon. She came to him. That was the thing that struck me most in retrospect. She did not send a letter, did not relay a message through the solicitor. She came herself to the house where Strathmore was staying on Charlotte Square, and she was shown into the drawing room while I happened to be present, too startled to excuse myself before it became rude to do so. She sat across from him with her hands in her lap, and she said, I have found no other solution. I accept your offer, but I wish to set terms. Strathmore inclined his head slightly. Go on. The debt is settled as a loan from you to me, with a written agreement specifying a rate of repayment to be arranged once the mill's income is restored. I will not accept a gift. I will not accept charity. If you insist on framing it as either, I withdraw. Agreed. The estate deed and all documents related to Caldenvale remain in my name. You acquire no claim to the property, the mill, or the land. Agreed. She paused. You may find, she said carefully. That society draws its own conclusions about the arrangement. I cannot prevent that. No, he said, you cannot. She looked at him then with something I could not quite read, as if she were calculating not a debt but a person, and finding the arithmetic more complicated than she had expected. Why, she said quietly, the truth of it, not the version about my father. I thought she had miscalculated. I thought Strathmore would simply refuse to answer, as he refused most things he did not wish to discuss. But he looked at her steadily and said, because Hexworth has done this before, 3 times in the last 4 years that I know of. The first family lost everything. The second lost their daughter to Aldous' keeping. I did not move quickly enough then. I am moving quickly enough now. The room was very still. That, she said, is the version I will accept. She rose, and she extended her hand not as a woman expecting to have it kissed, but as a person concluding an agreement. He stood and shook it, and I thought, there it is. Whatever this is going to be, it has just begun. The arrangement was signed that same day. Hexworth received his sum with something between fury and bewilderment. Aldous Hexworth was never mentioned again in my presence. Miss Faraday returned to Caldenvale with the deed in her own hands and a repayment schedule to be revisited in the spring. I expected that to be the end of it. Strathmore was not, as a rule, a man who revisited. What I did not account for was the letter she wrote him 3 weeks later, which he showed me only because it arrived while I was with him at Strathmore House, and because I suspect he was not sure what to do with it and found it easier to hand it to someone else and watch their face. The letter was 2 pages. It was, on the surface, a business communication, a report on the mill's current output, the repairs that had been started on the wheel housing, the tenants' harvest figures, and what they implied for the winter stores. It was not the letter of a woman who had recently been rescued. It was the letter of a mill owner reporting to a creditor, precise and clear and revealing, in its very precision, someone who had been managing this property in their head long before they were legally permitted to do so. She is running the mill herself, I said. Yes, at 23. She has been running it since her father fell ill 2 years ago. She told me. He said it without inflection, but something in his face, a quality of attention, the way a man looks when he is listening very carefully to something he did not expect to hear, told me the story. He wrote back, I did not see that letter. Over the following months, they exchanged correspondence with a regularity that I found increasingly difficult to describe as merely professional. He went to Caldenvale once, in February, ostensibly to review the repair progress on the wheel. He stayed 3 days. He returned with the particular expression of a man who has discovered something inconvenient. Tell me, I said. She showed me the accounts, he said. She has increased the mill's output by 12% since the autumn. She has renegotiated the grain contracts with 4 neighboring farms. And I said. He was quiet for a moment. And the tenants call her Miss Elinor, he said, and the children follow her to the gate when she leaves and wait there until she comes back. I said nothing. He looked at me with the expression he reserves for things he finds both inevitable and irritating. Say it. I don't think I need to, I said. I went to the repayment signing myself. Strathmore asked me to witness the document, and I think he also wanted someone present who could verify, for his own quiet satisfaction, that the thing had been done cleanly. Hexworth was not there. He had removed himself from Edinburgh for the winter, as men tend to do when a scheme has failed publicly enough that their appearance in the usual rooms becomes awkward. His solicitor attended in his place, a thin man who signed everything with the expression of someone who would have preferred to be elsewhere, and who did not speak to Miss Faraday directly in any way, I observed. She signed the loan document with Strathmore on one side and me on the other, and she read every word before she did, calmly and without apology for the time it took, which I respected enormously. When she was finished, she handed the pen back to the solicitor, and she said, to no one in particular, "That is settled, then?" Not triumphantly, simply as a fact. Strathmore walked her out. I followed at a distance, not intending to, but the stairwell was narrow, and we all ended up on the pavement together. She thanked him. He said she was welcome. There was a pause that lasted slightly longer than was strictly necessary, and then she said she had a carriage waiting, and he said he hoped the road north was clear of snow. And she left. He stood on the pavement for a moment and watched the carriage until it turned the corner. Then he turned to me and said, "Don't." "I haven't said anything," I said. "No," he said, and I'd prefer you continue in that vein. I did for approximately 2 weeks. He was right that society had drawn its conclusions. By February, the Edinburgh Assembly Rooms had it on excellent authority that the Highland Duke of Strathmore had settled a young woman's estate for reasons that went beyond principle, and the word had spread south from there at the usual pace. None of this touched Miss Faraday directly, as far as I knew. She rarely came to Edinburgh, had no interest in balls or assemblies, and seemed, from what Strathmore told me, largely untroubled by other people's opinions of her. He told me this in the tone of a man reporting something he finds admirable and is only slightly unsettled by, and I filed it alongside every other piece of evidence I was collecting. But in March she came to Edinburgh. Not to see Strathmore, she was there to meet with a grain merchant and to consult with a solicitor about the water rights deed, which she was having reviewed and strengthened against any future claim. She told Strathmore this in a note delivered to Charlotte Square on the morning of her arrival, matter of fact and brief, as if she were telling him the weather. She did not ask to see him. She did not ask for anything. He arranged to be at the same solicitor's office at the same hour. I was not there. He told me about it afterward, with the reluctant precision of a man who knows what the story sounds like and cannot help telling it accurately anyway. She was surprised to see him, not displeased but surprised. The grain merchant had kept her longer than expected, and she was still in her traveling things, a dark green cloak with road dust on the hem, when she came out of the solicitor's office and found him waiting in the anteroom. "I had not arranged to see you," she said. "No," he agreed. "Then why are you here?" He said, "I wanted to know that the water rights deed was sound." She looked at him. "You could have sent a letter." "I could have." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The deed is sound, better than sound, your name is not on it." "I know." "I made certain of that," she said, and it came out slightly fiercer than she'd clearly intended. "I know what people are saying, I know what it looks like. I need you to understand that I have not, that I am not." She stopped and began again. "I am not in your debt in any way other than the written one, and I intend to repay that as agreed." He said, "I know that." "Then what?" She stopped again. She was not, I think, a woman who stopped mid-sentence as a general rule. He said, "I came because I wanted to see you. That is all. If you would prefer I had not, I will leave." I understand that she was quiet for long enough that it became its own kind of answer. I understand she did not tell him to leave. They walked. That is what he told me. They walked in the March cold along the High Street and down toward Grassmarket, which is not, I should say, the obvious choice for the Highland Duke of Strathmore and a mill owner from the River Cald, but there it is. The High Street in March is no ballroom. It is coal smoke and fishwives and the smell of something unidentifiable from the closes, and Strathmore walked through it as if it were his own estate, because he walks through every place as if it were his own estate, and she walked beside him and did not seem to notice the cold at all. He told me she talked about the water rights first, the legal language of the new deed, which she had pressed the solicitor to make watertight in a way the original had not been, closing every possible loop that Hexworth or anyone of his kind might attempt to thread through in future years. She knew the document better than the solicitor did, he said. She had come prepared with her own notes, which she had apparently drafted in the carriage on the road from Caldenvale, and the solicitor had found himself agreeing to amendments he had not anticipated. After the water rights, she talked about the tenants, the older farmer with the east field, the millwright whose repairs had come in under the estimate he'd given in October because he'd found a better approach to the wheel housing once he'd had time to study it properly, the young family in the northernmost cottage who'd had a difficult autumn, and whose grain debt she had forgiven quietly, noting it in the accounts as a charitable expense and explaining to no one except herself. And then, at some point in Grassmarket, she talked about her father, not in grief, or not in grief as the word usually functions, the raw and open kind, but in the way of a person who has lived with a loss long enough that it has settled into something quieter and more permanent. She told him about the way her father had thought about the mill, not as a source of income or even as a legacy, but as a mechanism, a thing that existed to serve the valley it sat in, and how she had grown up watching him weigh every decision through that lens until she did not know how to weigh decisions any other way. He told me he had listened to all of this and found it, and here he paused, and I waited, because when Strathmore pauses, it means he is saying something he has not quite said before, that he found it clarifying. In a way, very few things had been clarifying since he was a young man, and the world seemed to offer more clarity. He told me what he said in return, which I will reproduce here because it is the most words I have ever known him to volunteer about himself. That he had found in the last several months that Strathmore House felt larger than it had previously felt. Not in any practical sense. The building was exactly the same, but in the sense that rooms he had occupied for years seemed recently to have acquired more space than was comfortable, and that he had begun to think about the River Cald in a way that had nothing to do with the repayment schedule. She stopped walking. "That is not straightforward," she said. "No, I don't know how to answer it." "You don't have to. Not now." She looked at him for a long time, there on the cobblestones of Grassmarket with the cold coming in from the east and a coal seller's cart clattering past. Then she said, with the same quiet directness she had used in the solicitor's office in November, "I think you should come to Caldenvale in the spring, to see the wheel when it is running properly, if you wish to." He said he would. He came in May. I heard about May from both of them, independently and without either knowing I had spoken to the other, which gave me, I think, as complete a picture as I could have hoped for. The wheel was magnificent, that much they agreed on. The millwright had done exceptional work on the housing, and in the spring runoff the River Cald moved with a force that made the whole mechanism sing. She showed him every part of it, from the sluice gate to the grain loft, with the pride of someone showing you a living thing they had nursed back to health. He followed, and listened, and asked questions that told her he had read everything she had written in those letters. On the second day, he met the tenants. She introduced him without ceremony. "This is the Duke of Strathmore. He helped us last autumn." And they received him with a wariness that thawed over the course of the afternoon, when it became clear to them that he was genuinely interested in what they told him, and genuinely unbothered by where he was standing when they told him. One of the older farmers gave him a tour of the East Field with the solemnity of a man presenting a cathedral. The children who waited for Miss Elinor at the gate regarded him with assessment, and then, apparently, decided he was acceptable. On the third evening they walked down to the river at dusk. The water was high with the spring, running silver and cold between the banks, and the wheel was still, the day's grinding done. She told him, he said, about the first winter after her father fell ill, how she had kept the accounts herself, not because she chose to, but because no one else would, and how she had understood at some point that she was not simply managing someone else's mill, but building something she believed in. She had not said this to anyone before. I think she was surprised she was saying it then. He told her, she told me, that he had spent most of his adult life managing Strathmore, the estates, the tenants, the disputes, the endless machinery of land and title, and had found it largely satisfying, in the way that anything you are good at is satisfying, without finding it particularly meaningful. And that in the last 6 months, reading her letters, he had thought for the first time about the difference between the two. "That is a dangerous thing to admit," she said. "I am awares. You could have kept it to yourself." "I find," he said, "that I can't." She looked at the river. She said, "I thought in November that you were another man with power who intended to use it. I apologize for that." "You were right to think it," he said. "It is what usually happens." "But not this time." "No," he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I was not prepared for you, Miss Faraday." She turned to look at him. The river moved. He said, "I would like to make you a proposal, a real one, not a debt, not an arrangement, not a solution to a problem. I would like, if you are willing, to make you a proposal, and I want you to know before I do that the mill is yours, the estate is yours, the water rights are yours, the deed is yours, and none of that changes regardless of your answer. I want that to be perfectly clear." She said it was clear. He said what he meant to say. I do not know her exact answer. I know that they came back from the river after dark. I know that the following morning he sent for me with a note that said only, "Come to Caldenvale." I know that when I arrived, 3 days later, she shook my hand with the warmth of someone who has decided to trust you and is not in the habit of half measures, and that Strathmore had the look of a man who had recently discovered something he had not known was missing from him and was not entirely sure what to do with the relief. The wedding was in June at the small stone church at the edge of the Caldenvale estate. It was not an Edinburgh wedding, not a society occasion in any form the society in question would have recognized. There was no ballroom, no procession of notable names. There were tenants, and the millwright, and the older farmer who had showed Strathmore the East Field, and the children from the gate, and myself, and a handful of others who had known Edmund Faraday and came because they wished his daughter well. Strathmore stood at the altar in a coat that was excellent without being showy, which was exactly like him, and waited with the patience of a man who has learned, later than some, what is worth being patient for. When she came in, she was wearing deep green silk, her color not the white of a first formal marriage which she had never had, and the choice of which struck me as entirely right. She walked herself, which was also entirely right. She did not look nervous. She looked like a woman arriving precisely where she intended to arrive. At some point in the ceremony, when the promises were made, I saw Hexworth's name briefly cross my mind. The Baron, the cousin, the 30-day deadline, the document on the table in November. And I thought about how completely the world had turned on something as small as a single morning's arrival. She said the words clearly. He said them with the focused precision of a man who means everything he says and knows it. When it was done, they walked out into the June morning, and the children from the gate were waiting at the church door, because children always know, and she stopped and spoke to each one, and he stood beside her and watched with an expression I had seen on his face exactly never before, open and warm, and entirely without the armor he had worn for every public moment I had known him through. One of the smaller children seized his hand without asking. He looked down at the small hand and then across at a liner, and she was already watching him, steady and certain, and she said something quiet that I could not hear. He smiled. I had known Callum Devereux for more than 20 years by then, and I had seen that smile perhaps 4 times in all those years, and each time it had startled me, the way a fire startles you when you did not know the room was cold. The mill ran all that summer. The wheel turned in the river Cald, and the valley's grain was ground, and the tenants mended their fences and brought their harvest in, and Miss Elinor, her Grace the Duchess of Strathmore now, though she was still Miss Elinor to anyone who had known her before, kept the accounts with the same calm precision she had always kept them, and repaid the loan in full 2 years before the schedule required. She presented the final sum to her husband over dinner in the library of Caldenvale one October evening, the ledger open between them, the column of figures perfectly clear. He looked at the numbers for a long time. "You didn't have to rush it," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He looked at her across the table. "Is this about proving something?" "It was," she said. "In November it was entirely about proving something. Now it's about keeping my word." She paused, "and perhaps about the look on your face when the column closes." He looked down at the ledger. The column was closed. Every figure she had promised was there. He closed the book. He looked at her with the steady, unguarded warmth of a man who has long since stopped wearing his armor around one particular person, and he said, "Your father would have liked you very much." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know, he told me." I heard about that evening from neither of them. Some things are not for the telling. But I was at Caldenvale the following spring, and the spring after that, and I can report without sentiment that the mill still ran, and the wheel still turned, and the children still waited at the gate, and the Highland Duke of Strathmore, that feared, silent, impenetrable man I had known since boyhood, sat at the kitchen table of Caldenvale House on Tuesday mornings, and listened while his wife read him the week's accounts, and made him understand, with patient and absolute certainty, exactly why the river mattered. That is the story as I know it. Edmund Faraday's debt was paid in November, on a grey Edinburgh morning, and what it bought was something no one in that solicitor's office had reckoned for. Least of all, I suspect, either of them,